Good morning. I'm Daryl Brugink, Executive Editor with No-Till Farmer, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's webinar where we're going to look into ways to improve the tilth and nutrient availability of no-till soils with the addition of gypsum. And today's No-Till Farmer webinar is sponsored by Gypsoil brand Gypsum. We want to thank the folks at Gypsoil for making today's webinar possible. And we also want to thank our presenter, Cory Schurman, National Sales Manager for Gypsoil, for sharing the latest research, information, and experiences regarding the use and impact of gypsum on no-till soils. So with that said, we want to thank you again for joining us, and we're going to turn over the controls to Cory Schurman. Good morning, Cory. How are you today?
Good morning. Doing real well. Can you hear me, Daryl?
We hear you just fine. You sound good.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Okay. Well, we'll get started. We'll talk about the attributes of using gypsum. A lot of people ask questions about, what is gypsum and, how long has it been around? And it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It was but used back in the 1500s. And we get a lot of questions, and growers are asking to understand the value of maybe what that can do for them and on how can we help the profitability on their farm, with the lower grain prices that we're looking at. We have to figure out how to be as good as we can and keep the pencil as sharp as we can. Flue gas desulfurization, and what that is, it's where we're scrubbing the sulfur dioxide gases from the emissions that come from coal-fired power plants. With the Clean Air Act of 1991, we have to have EPA mandates, so we have to have that done. And so what it does when we're done with that is we create what we call calcium sulfite dihydrate, which ends up being about 20 to 23% calcium and about 16 to 18% sulfate. And it's an extremely clean product because it's done, the ash part of burning coal goes to the bottom, and this is the clean part of the coal that's going out. And so what we're able to do is create a product that's extremely clean. And if you look there on the far left there under regulatory limits, that's what the EPA says that we can, have in FGD gypsum. If you look at the second level there, it's one of our sources up in Wisconsin from We Energies. That's a sample taken in 2010, and if you look at the arsenic and the cadmium and the lead and the molybdenum, they're not even detectable. And then if you look at even like copper and mercury and nickel and selenium and zinc, we're in the very small amount of what would even be allowed. So it's an extremely clean product that a grower can feel very safe putting on their fields and on their soils. That's one of the biggest questions that I get a lot of times about FGD gypsum. Is it a safe product? And it's very safe. We do a lot of stuff to maintain, the quality control. A lot of it is we do a lot of stuff that we do on a regular and consistent basis just to stay in compliance with all the government regulations. We work with the distributors, our hauling partners, and the growers to make sure that application parameters are followed, and we keep, of course, all the necessary paperwork for the general use of gypsum in ag use. But it's an extremely clean product, and so it starts out clean and it ends up clean. And so it's a good product for growers to use. And I get, the second questions that I get most generally are, well, what does this do for me? And these are kind of the top, attributes of what I've put together for what a grower sees from using gypsum. And we won't get to be able to talk about all these today because I don't think we'll have time, but one of the biggest ones that we see is root development. And if we're gonna grow a crop, first thing we need to do is grow a good healthy root system. The purpose of a root structure really is to anchor that plant, provide nutrient uptake, provide water uptake, exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, stores carbohydrates, sugars, and proteins. Normally, when we look at root systems, if we can increase the root mass 10%, we can typically increase the overall nutrient absorption potential by almost 100%. So increasing that root mass is huge to maximizing those yields and getting us to where we want to go. If you look at the ingredients in a corn or a soybean yield, and if you look at carbon dioxide and 200 bushel of corn, we've got almost 260,000 semi-trailer loads of air, about 1,300 trailer loads of air per bushel. It's kind of if you look at it that way. And for 80 bushel beans, it's even more. If you look at the glucose to sugar component, we have about 20,000 pounds in 200 bushel corn and about 24,000 pounds in 80 bushel soybeans. If you look at water, Look at how much water is in the ingredients in our crop. But if you go clear to the bottom here, you see the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium components, but look how much calcium we need and how much sulfur we need. And a lot of times we forget that, or we don't apply those, and so that's not part of our normal thought process. A lot of times we think of NPK. We all know that it takes nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, but we never think about the supporting elements for that. Nutrients are mobile in the soil and immobile, and your mobile nutrients are really suited to surface application. Large root zone. If you look there on the right, you see the root system. Those nutrients can move to that plant. As water is drawn to that plant by the plant absorbing the water, it's moving those nutrients to it. Your immobile nutrients are the ones that really we have a very limited uptake structure. And a lot of times, if you look at phosphorus as an example, phosphorus, they say in a normal year will move less than a quarter of an inch. So if your root hairs are more than a quarter of an inch away from your phosphorus, well, it means you're going to have very small amount of uptake. And so anything we can do to break that soil down, not break it down, but flocculate that soil, open that soil up, increase that root mass, really allows us to have better efficiency of all of our nutrients. And so that's why root mass can be such a huge important part of what we do. If you look at the soil and what's occupied in the soil by the root volume, if you look at corn there on the bottom, it says in the top 8 inches of soil that a crop is grown in, that that crop is only touching about 0.4% of the soil in the top 8 inches. So it's a very small amount. So it's very important that we can increase that root mass to try to maximize that. It's also important when we look at nutrient placement and getting the best nutrient efficiency we can. And so when you look at those nutrients that are mobile, that how they can move to that plant, and when you think about immobile nutrients, how they really almost have to be in very close contact for utilization to happen, and what we want to, the reactions that we need from our nutrient applications. Next one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil balance. And a lot of times, I do a lot of meetings, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that I think soil balance is actually as important as quantity. A lot of times we worry about, well, how many pounds do I need to apply? I think sometimes getting them in the right ratios and making sure that we have the right amounts for what we have of other nutrients in the soil is really important. Liebig's law of the minimum says that whatever we're in the shortest capacity is going to be our biggest yield limiting factor. And we can have all the nitrogen in the world there, but if we don't have the supporting elements to nitrogen of sulfur and magnesium and manganese, all the things that make that work, well, we're really not going to get good efficiency of all that nitrogen. All right, so our yield is going to be limited by what we call, the shortest stave, or the one that the highest level. And I've had growers that have all the NPK in the world, but then they have soil compaction that they work in. So that's their yield limiting factor. So we always have to figure out what is the biggest yield limiting factor we have, and how can we maximize our potential and what we get to have happen. One of the first things from a nutrient perspective that I'll ask a grower to do is look at soil testing. That's a big part of it. And when you look at soil testing, I think it's important that, number one, you collect a sufficient number of samples to adequately represent what you're being tested. And I get growers that make 20 acres one sample. I get growers that make 2/10 of an acre one sample. I think you have to decide however you're farming. Grid sampling is great. If you don't grid sample, that's good too. The more information, the better. But just make sure you collect if you've got an area that's 5 acres, you want to make sure that you're adequately sampling that area to get the results that you need, or the information that you need to make a decision. Follow your instructions provided by your soil testing lab. And most generally soil tests that I like to look at are in that top 6 inches is kind of what we like to look at. And then sample at the proper time. When we say proper time, fall is good, spring is good. I will say that I like to have a grower follow the same steps every year. So if you're doing fall every year, that's great, but continue doing that. Don't go from fall one year and then spring the next. That sometimes tends to vary your results a little bit. You have to realize that it's going to take your lab a little bit of time to process those tests when you send them in. So don't just send them in one day and expect a result the next day. A lot of times I'll have growers a few days before planting, oh, we got to pull a soil test, and so allow those tests to have time to be processed. And it usually takes about 3 days is kind of the shortest I've ever seen, and up to about 2 weeks or so. Follow the same sampling pattern if possible. I like to see a grower use GPS to mark out their soil probes and where they're taking that, and so that they can come back in the future and take virtually the same soil test, and so they can come back and get virtually the same type of test. And so that really helps with our consistency, because soil's very variable, and you can see a lot of changes in that. So if you can follow those with GPS cords, you can take run, and then follow a sampling probe that meets the management level needs of a grower. And I think that's just common sense, all good things that you can do to kind of come up with. But this will help us determine where do we start. It kind of determines where we need to go. When you get your soil test results, you have to think about your nutrients really as ions, and ions are electrically charged molecules. You have your cations, your positive charged ions, and you have your anions, your negatively charged ions. If you look at the cations in the soil, potassium, ammonium, magnesium, calcium, manganese, zinc, and hydrogen, and then your anions, these tend to be the ones here on the top that move the most, nitrate and sulfate. But then you also have phosphate, chloride, borate, and molybdenate. All those are nutrients, and so you want to think about those as anions and how they get into the plant. Non-nutrients that sometimes we have to contend with as well is sodium, aluminum, the hydroxyl ions, bicarbonate, and carbonate. And so we have to think about those, and sometimes keeping those in the right balance as well can be very beneficial. When you look at the next thing that I a lot of times look at is cation exchange capacity, and this is the soil's ability to exchange the positive charged cations off to the soil solution. All right, and your clay, as you see there on the left, your clay tends to be really heavy. CECs in the high 20s and 30s. 40s, and then you have your sandy soils on the right where you have the really low numbers. And I had a soil professor one time that says, think of CEC as a parking lot. If you have a really sandy soil, you have a parking lot the size of Walmart, and if you have a really heavy clay soil, well, you have a parking lot the size of Minneapolis. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So when we think about CEC, we really have to think about the amount of maybe a soil amendment like gypsum, that we would need to apply to cause a change. And so if we have high CEC levels, we're going to have to increase the amount that we would want to apply to affect the same response as we would in a sandy soil with a smaller CEC. And then we look at percent base saturation, and percent base saturation, it's the proportion of the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and hydrogen within a given capacity known as the CEC. And so what it is it's the ratio or the amount of them. It's kind of like your grandmother's homemade apple pie. If you don't have the ingredients right, if you put all the same ingredients but you don't use the right amounts, you're not going to have what we want. And a lot of times that's what we find with soil. And a lot of times we can look at this and we can help achieve better soil balance, better nutrient efficiency, better water efficiency, a lot of things that we can do, root capacity that we can do to make this work when we get these in the right percentages. The percentages that we kind of strive to shoot for. And not always can these be achieved. Sometimes you just have to work towards this. Sometimes it takes many years to get there. Sometimes soils are already in very good balance, and all we're doing is using small amounts to maintain that. But we try to get our soils from a base saturation percentage with calcium to about 70 to 80% is a pretty good number. I think 75 is really the perfect number if you can get there. Magnesium in about 10 to 15%. I think 12% is the perfect number if we can get there. Potassium, we strive to get to about 3 to 5%. And then sodium, we really want to make sure we try to keep that below 2.5%. Sometimes that's a struggle in soils too, but one thing that I kind of point out is that we want to make sure we keep the potassium or the sodium number lower than our potassium, because our plants can't really discriminate or tell those two apart. And so if we take potassium, we get plant growth and cell growth. If we take up sodium, we get cell disruption and damage. And so we want to try to always make sure that we have our potassium number that are higher than our sodium number. When you look at your cations in the soil from flocculation, or aeration capacity, opening that soil up, and so water can soak in, we can get good aeration of our soils. This is kind of a good picture of that, and if we look at the atomic weight, there of calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, hydrogen, you can see the charges and the size. And so obviously the more calcium we can have in there, the more we can flocculate that soil or open that soil up. Tends to really make those soils work better for us and get us to where we really want to get to. One of a simple math equation that I do a lot of times to kind of give a starting point, for a grower to look at is I'll look at my soil CEC, because again, we go back to that parking lot. A higher number means I'm going to have to take a lot more. And so if, let's say, have a base saturation of 55 and I want to get to 75, so I've decided I wanted to have a 20% change is my desire. I've got a CEC of 18. All right, so I would take 20 times 18 times 400. Now 400 is the milliequivalent value of calcium, and that's where we take the atomic weight times the valence when we look at the periodic table chart. And so we'll come up with a number of 144,000. We have to convert that back into a percentage. We started with a percentage, we have to convert it back, so we'll divide that by 100, and we'll come up with, for this soil, roughly around 1,440 pounds of calcium to kind of get us into the calcium base saturation number we want to get to for the best, flocculation. And if I'm going to look at that with using gypsum's 20 to 23% calcium, I'm going to recommend for that soil roughly about 1 ton of gypsum per acre over the next 3 years. And and a lot of guys will say, well, is that it? If I fixed it, maybe not. We have to look at the subsoils as well. What we'll do is pull more soil tests and kind of reevaluate where are we at, and where we do we still need to make more progress, or where are we going. Sometimes I'll take a soil test. Take a soil test below that 6-inch layer. I'll go down, from maybe 6 to 12, or even 12 to 18, and then 18 even down to 24. And I get a lot of growers that say, well, I want to farm more acres, I want to farm more land, but I'm going to do it in depth. Instead of farming 1,000 acres 6 inches deep, I want to farm 1,000 acres 12 inches deep, effectively doubling my farmland. And a lot of times you see the high contest winners. That's what they're doing, is their soils are deeper. They've got good mellow soils, nutrient exchange happening in a deeper zone than a lot of the times other growers do. And so it's one of the things that we can do with this. And so you can continue to look at this. And this is just a starting point. This is a good place to kind of give you an idea of where you want to go and what you can have happen. When we look at magnesium, because I think magnesium is important as too, magnesium on a soil test, that percentage of base saturation, it indicates a lot of times our potential soil temperatures, because if we have a real high percent magnesium, we're getting above that 15% where we really want to be. A lot of times we see, in the spring, it's hard to get those soils to warm up like we want them to do. Sometimes they hold on to those cold temperatures a little bit. A lot of times they're subject to some internal drainage issues and maybe hard pans. Sometimes we struggle with calcium solubility and calcium availability, and a lot of times potassium availability as well. And a lot of times if we see high percentage magnesium base saturation, it really does indicate a strong need for sulfur in the soil as well. What we're able to do a lot of times is change soil a little bit, and this is kind of an enlarged edge of a clay crystal, and what we're able to do is, with the sulfate component, is drive off some of those excess magnesiums and replace them back in with calcium. And so what you're doing is you're getting your ratio right. We're getting to that, that higher percentages of magnesium and maybe a little lower in, or higher percentage of calcium, and a little lower in the magnesium a little bit. So it just really helps to change the soil's ability to, I guess, do a lot of things, and we'll keep talking about some of these. Well, you want to keep in mind the relationship of nutrient elements to plant functions. If you look at photosynthesis, they say there's 9 elements in photosynthesis, and if you look through these, you get photosynthesis, enzymes, protein, carbohydrate, metabolism, hormones, osmotic pressure, translocation, calcium and sulfur actually are big components with most of these. And have a big function and play a lot of role as a nutrient. Not only do we want to get our balance right in the soil, we want to make sure we have plenty of that nutrient for that plant as well, and so that we're able to get that plant to accomplish what we want it to happen, and give us the yields that we're going to need to have to stay, economical in the ag market. Next, we talk a little bit about soil compaction. A lot of growers worry about soil compaction. It's something that we see a lot of times. I'm a pilot and I fly a fair amount, and when you're flying over almost any part of the country, a lot of times you can see compaction tracks from tillage operations or combines in a lot of fields. And sometimes the more stressful years that we have, these things show up even more yet. And so compaction is a big issue in almost any field, or could be in any field. We did a economic study in conjunction with No-Till Farmer here earlier this year, and some researchers from Ohio State University did it, and they polled growers that were using gypsum. And of those growers that we talked about from soil improvement, improving rooting, 68% of the people we polled said that they had an improved rooting capacity. 64 said they had improved emergence in their soils, and 57% of the people polled reducing soil crusting. And so I think those are things that we can achieve with gypsum and make those things happen and help growers get the results that they need to have. When you look at good soil structure, what is good soil structure? It's the arrangement of soil particles with respect to each other into a pattern that moves water and air and freely, and then enhances biological soil life. And so what you're doing is you're getting that water and that needed air down into those soil zones, and you're pushing biological development. You're pushing the development of all those little things that we can't always fix on our own. We have to just provide the environment so that they can fix themselves. And that's one of the things that we can do when we get good soil structure. Cations affect, how do these cations affect humus in the soil? Calcium, of course, is a flocculation nutrient. It's the biggest element, like I was showing before. It creates voids and air spaces in the soils. Your magnesium, your potassium, your hydrogen, sodium, well, they potassium or peptides, and they normally are not going to aid in the aggregation of soil. And aggregation is where you're getting that soil, to be open up and have good clumping ability. And soil is, when you hold that soil and it holds together in your soil, but then when you fold or drop it, it falls apart. That's good aggregation of soil. Here's kind of a picture of it. This was done by Dr. Jerry Bigham from Ohio State University, and it talks about soil dispersion is mainly caused by highly hydrated ions, such as sodium and magnesium being attracted to the surface of the clay particles. And this shows a good picture of that and how what we're getting in, what we really want to shoot, the flocculated clay versus the dispersed clay, and how we can do that. And so we can create our soil properties that we want to have happen. One of the things that I a lot of times talk about is compaction, and how most crops that we grow in the United States have a rooting pressure of approximately about 300 pounds per square inch. And sometimes soils where we have those really high magnesium contents, where we get those tighter soils, can be pretty, well in excess of that. With the penetrometer, sometimes you'll see that gauge go clear up into the 400 or 500 range. So when we've got more pressure in our soil than our crops can push through, we obviously are going to see very limited, root depth. And a lot of times when we see those compaction layers, you'll see those roots go down, they hit those hard pans, and then they grow laterally instead of going deeper, reducing our development of a root. When we can keep calcium, more available in our soil, we can keep that soil more flocculated, reduce that soil cohesion and those compaction layers significantly. So again, it gives us that greater root development and where we want to go. I think we need to talk a little bit about microbes in the soil, because I think that ties right in with soil compaction. Soil biology plays a huge role in soils and what they can do. With the economic study that we did, it showed, many of the growers, 57.8% said that they saw enhanced biological activity in their soil. And when we do those things, one of the side things that we see a lot of times is we're decreasing soil erosion. and so we're doing it. So you're getting better biological activity. When you have biological activity, you're getting better efficiency from your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium applications, all your other elements as well. And so anytime we can influence biology, it's going to be a huge win for a field or for a crop's potential. A lot of times I get questions about, what is soil biology, and it's something that's hard to even really put your hand on it. In about 3.5 ounces of soil, there's about 10 billion microorganisms. It's about 100 grams, 3.5 ounces, and I don't know who had to count all those. That's a lot of them to count, but there's a lot of stuff in our soil. We have bacteria, the fungi, the algae, the actinomyces, the earthworms, protozoans, nematodes. We have a whole bunch of stuff that are breaking the residue we leave down or behind, breaking that down into usable nutrients for the crops, breaking down the fertilizer we're applying, making it so the plant can absorb those nutrients. A lot of things that are in there to make the plant, the plant growth, the soil functions work and function. And so it's a big part of that in creating, humus and organic matter. There's a whole bunch of stuff that the soil biology do. So if we can increase those, we're going to do a little better job. They hold soil particles together sometimes better than cations. One of the things, I was with a grower here a while back, and we were actually digging in the soil, and we were taking a same amount of soil from each side. We were taking a square foot and going down 8 inches and digging up the dirt, and then we were counting the earthworms. And where we were using gypsum, we were seeing about double the amount of earthworms, and it's because that soil was looser, and so those earthworms have a better place to live, and so they can reproduce. We have more of them, we get more earthworms, we get more air channels in our soil. We get more air channels, we get more biology. Get more biology, you get better utilization of your nutrients wherever they come from. And so we see a lot of stuff that increasing the soil biology can help and make better. I'm going to talk a little bit about NPK efficiency. Fertilizers is expensive, and we want to make sure we get the full value from using those nutrients. Gypsum applications can significantly increase the efficiency of your NPK. When we did the economic study, long-term users report about a 10 to even up to a 30% increase or improvement in their fertilizer efficiency, and we see that a lot of times. And I think there's several reasons for that, but primarily it's because you're creating a better soil environment. You've got better oxygenation, you've got better biological activity, you're getting more chances, for that nutrient to be broken down, be utilized. But then also with the root development that we talked about, if we can increase our root mass, like I said, 10%, we can potentially increase our nutrient absorption 100%. Well, sometimes we can increase our root mass, 20, 30%. And so growers can get a lot better efficiency from their nutrients and their fertilizer applications. A lot of things affect our nutrient efficiency in the soil. A lot of times we don't think about it, and one of the big ones for nitrogen is calcium and magnesium. A lot of times we don't ever think of that, and a lot of times when I see calcium levels on a base saturation test drop below 60, I know that we're going to reduce our nitrogen uptake, and so I start increasing my nitrogen applications a little bit, not dramatically, but a little bit, because I don't have the soil structure to support good nitrogen utilization. And when I see magnesium get above that 15, and boy, 20 is almost, I consider it to be a little bit of a cliff when it comes to nitrogen. When we start getting above 20%, your nitrogen efficiency really drops. Of course, then we have excess residue, or if we have cold, wet, saturated soils. All those are things where we maybe need to increase those nitrogen applications by 20 to 30%. Under the phosphorus test, and what makes phosphorus, there's a lot of things that we can affect with phosphorus by the application of gypsum as well. For number one is soil pH. Now, you're not going to change soil pH with gypsum, but if we can supply available calcium, you're keeping that soil, or that phosphorus more available when we have more neutral pHs. Soil compaction, of course, anytime, because phosphorus moves very little, we're going to have better root development. Soil aeration, anytime we have aeration, we're increasing those biology levels. If you look at soil moisture, anytime we have moisture stress, phosphorus availability is going to go down. So if we have better water holding capacity, better draining capacity, we're going to keep our phosphorus more available. The last one is soil organic matter. or the last page is organic matter and crop residues. All of those have big effects on our phosphorus. If we and then we have to look at plant roots and also the fungi levels that we have in the soil as well. And so with gypsum, we can affect a lot of these things and make our phosphorus more available. And when we look at potassium, we have to look at soil, of course, CEC. The better we can have soil in balance, the better we're going to do a better job, because potassium is one of the weaker cations. When we can keep our calcium and our magnesium in relationship where they need to be, our potassium availability goes up. Of course, one of the things that really affects potassium is the soil test level that we have. The cation balance that we have are big parts of it. Soil moisture, soil pH, soil temperature, soil compaction, drainage and aeration, and of course salinity. Now we can affect a lot of these with the applications of gypsum. You can keep, again, open those soils up, let them breathe, let that water soak away, let that water also, when it gets dry, percolate back up through as well. And so a lot of things that we can do from potassium. So we're able to keep, the NPK that a grower is buying more efficient. And so if you can increase, the efficiency 10 to 30%, I don't know too many growers that spend, less than $100 an acre on their fertility program, and a lot of growers are spending over $200 an acre. And so, a 20% return or increase in that value can be pretty significant. And for making crops, getting the dollars that you want out of your value. When we look at sulfur, sulfur is a big component in crop growth, and we don't get the sulfur that we used to get. And I'll show a map here in a little bit, but sulfur is the active ingredient in growing plants. It's needed, for the essential amino acids, the cysteine, the methylamine, methionine, I guess how you say it. Without these amino acids, proteins can't be built, and your plants aren't going to grow. Sulfur is not very mobile within the plant. Your roots take up sulfur as sulfate. Sulfate moves with water into your leaves. Sulfate is built in your organic compounds, and those organic compounds move anywhere proteins are being made. Sulfur deficiency, and I'll show a picture over here in a little bit, but sulfur deficiency is you yellowing on the lower leaves, and not on the, sulfur deficiency on the upper leaves. And because it's not mobile, your new growth, as it's growing, it needs that sulfur up above, so it can't pull that. And so a lot of times you'll see your yellowing in the upper leaves when you see sulfur deficiency. In the plant, sulfur helps form proteins in the form of enzymes that are used to perform other functions, glucose synthesis, carbon dioxide assimilation, into fixation, form nodule formation in our legumes, and help seed survive in low temperatures. These bottom two lines, I think, are maybe one of the most important things you can remember when it comes to sulfur, is that before you ever plant the seed of a grass crop, of say a corn crop or a wheat crop, they start out wanting a ratio of about 14 pounds. For every 14 pounds of nitrogen, they want 1 pound of sulfur. All right, and if you look at a legume crop, your soybean crops, your alfalfa, they start out actually wanting even more. So for about every 10 pounds of nitrogen, they want or need from plant physiology about 1 pound of sulfur. It's kind of a general guideline. I have a lot of folks will say, well, I don't put nitrogen on my soybeans, or I don't put nitrogen on my alfalfa. But if you look at 60 bushel soybeans, they utilize almost 300 pounds of nitrogen. And so if you start looking at the ratios, well, we need to probably have an adequate supply of around 30 pounds plus of sulfur for our soybean crops. And I think it's one of the ways we can push soybeans to the next level, is making sure we're supplying the sulfur that our crops are going to need. Sulfur in the soil is important because it really kind of helps maintain a proper balance with other nutrients in the soil. A lot of times in high pH soils, we use sulfur because it creates acidulation, and it helps the process of diffusion, helping that plant to have more access to those nutrients that would normally not be available. It really helps in the soil with the formation and decomposition of organic matter in the soil. A lot of times the sulfur that is in the soil is in the organic matter, and it really tends to help with the breakdown of residue. A lot of times if guys are struggling with residue issues and getting rid of the residues, sulfur can be a big component in helping that happen as well. Soil type influences the availability of applied sulfur. Sandy soils are more prone to leaching but do not require that large quantity. Of course, sandy clay soils are going to bind it, making it less available. To work with that. In the soil, we don't get the sulfur we used to get. You see there on the top right there, you see the sulfate ion deposition, 1986. When you see, we got a lot of sulfur. When I was in school, we talked a lot about acid rain. It's something we heard a lot about. Well, you don't really hear so much about that anymore, and it's because with the Clean Air Act of 1991, we don't get the sulfur. We used to get in the Midwest, we used to get sometimes as much as 20 pounds of sulfur per acre per year, and now we don't. Now we're only sometimes only getting 2, maybe 3 pounds per year. And so we're seeing sulfur deficiencies. At the same time, we raise a lot more corn, and so our yields have gone up, so we're needing more sulfur. So there's several things that we're kind of creating a adverse reaction there, where we're not getting as much and we're needing more. Like I said earlier, your nitrogen deficiencies will a lot of times show up in a crop on your older leaves or on a corn crop on your lower leaves, and it's because nitrogen is mobile. As that new growth up on top needs nitrogen, well, it pulls it, and that's why we see yellowing in the bottom. But sulfur is not mobile, and so you see that yellowing in the new growth. You see the yellowing up above. So if you see yellow on top, it's typically going to start with sulfur. If you see yellowing on the bottom, typically going to start with nitrogen. Yield, of course, we all know what yields are going to do. In the economic study that we did, the long-term users are realizing more benefit, but they're saying a 10 to 12% return on alfalfa. And if you look at the $200 a ton alfalfa, that gets to be pretty valuable. And of course, corn, a 7 to 10 bushel yield change. And I put the numbers to that here a little bit. If we had an increase of 8% on a 200 bushel corn crop, well, that's 16 bushel. And if we use a cash grain price of $3 a bushel, it'd net a grower an additional $48. And if we had an 11% return on an 8-ton alfalfa crop, and we use a price of 200 ton, that gives a grower an additional about $176 an acre. Now this changes, of course, with the prices of grain. I've got growers that have got their corn sold for a lot more than that, and I've got growers that are paying a high basis and maybe not getting the $3. So you have to, I guess you can change those numbers to whatever you want them to be, but the economics do play into this, and they do help pay for the gypsum. Last little thing I want to talk a little bit about is reducing erosion and nutrient loss out of the soil. And this has been a big thing in the news lately with Lake Erie, and the algae blooms are talking about, they're talking about phosphorus runoff and soil loss. And so I think that's something that we can maybe fix or help fix with a gypsum application. But really, water infiltration is the key to getting this done. Remember that calcium, because it's a higher element, bigger element, it flocculates, and magnesium peptizes, disperses that clay, and so it tends to make those soils tighter. An ideal mix of soil elements that we kind of like to shoot for, 25% water, 25% air, about 45% minerals, and about 5% organic matter. Of that 5%, we kind of like 80% of it to be humus, 10% to be roots, and 10% to be microbiology. We did some water quality studies in the past, and this is one with Dr. Daryl Norton from the USDA, and this was done in 2012, and it just shows, when we look at soil loss, we look at runoff water, and then we look at soil reactive phosphorus that's causing a lot of the algae blooms in water bodies. If you look at the control there on the left, it's significantly higher than where we've done the applications of gypsum. And so I think it shows, the ability to reduce, soil loss, increase water quality benefits. Here's some pictures. This is a study that was done, led by Warren Dick from Ohio State University. This is where they did again, where they had collected 58 samples, and they're seeing about a 55% average reduction in that phosphate loss, and that soluble phosphate loss. And so I think these are the things that we can do to make those, increase, I guess, the soil's ability to absorb water, but also to let it pass through cleanly and not take those nutrients from the soil. Here's another study. This one was done with Greenleaf Advisors. This is in conjunction with Ohio State, again this is with Dr. Warren Dick. It's a picture there from before. It just showed the pictures, but it just shows the numbers of the 55% reduction. So this is the second year of the previous study. And so we're continuing these studies, and so we're showing that we can keep soil where it needs to be, we can keep the nutrients where they're supposed to be, keep them more available to the plant. With that, that's probably the end of it. I think we probably have a little bit of time for some questions. Daryl, so I'll let you, do you have the questions for me?
You bet. That sounds good, Cory. Thank you for the presentation today. And we'll, as I mentioned, you have the opportunity here. If you want to write in some questions, just drop them into that comment field, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. Got a couple here that were submitted ahead of the presentation from some of the folks who joined us today, and I want to get to those first. Cory, how vital would you say is adequate soil drainage to making a gypsum regimen work?
Well, drainage is important, I guess in anything. It gypsum, I've got a lot of growers that maybe rent land and don't want to spend the money on putting drainage lines in, and so they'll say, well, this I'll do this. I don't know if it's absolutely necessary to have that in there. Obviously, drainage is going to help in any soil, in any condition. I would say that, I've had, as an example, I've got growers that have had their tile lines on maybe 100-foot increments or 80-foot increments, and they'll go in and put heavy applications of gypsum in between and really increase their gypsum or their water, drainage. And so I think it's not, again, it's, not absolutely mandatory, but obviously it's going to be beneficial to helping that work.
But is it fair to say, though, that part of what you're trying to do quite often with gypsum is try and improve some soil tilth, which can lead to some better drainage situations? So
exactly, they would work very well together. They tie hand in hand.
Okay. Another question we got, and this one presented that if your water soluble numbers on soil tests are optimal, and by optimal, saying like a 7-to-1 ratio of calcium to magnesium. So if your water soluble numbers on soil tests are optimal, do you need to really look more at micronutrients for higher yield? I don't know if you can get into that one a little bit.
Actually, that's a great question, because one of the things we strive to is to get into those ratios of, depending on what crop we're growing a little bit, maybe it's 5-to-1, maybe it's even 10-to-1, but 7-to-1 is a good ratio to shoot for. If you're already there, well, your yield potential has probably gone up, and so when your yield potential goes up, obviously we want to look at the next yield limiting factor, and a lot of times it does get to be micronutrients. And I will tell you that growers that raise their yield potential, whatever that may be, maybe it's using gypsum, maybe it's getting things in the right ratios, I do think you want to pay extra attention to some of those things. And a lot of times, I'll have everything in really good condition. I've got good soil ratios, I've got good NPK levels, but boy, I don't have zinc or manganese, and so that's my yield limiting factor. And so I think that is something you want to look at. Look at those soil tests. That's a key component, and looking at that and getting those in the right ratios.
I've got a question here from somebody who I'm going to assume has high magnesium and high sodium soils, because their question is, how does gypsum affect high magnesium and high sodium soils?
Oh, sure. Great question. The sulfate component actually, SO4 with a negative, actually kind of acts like a hammer a little bit in the soil. And so what you're doing is you're able to break a lot of those cations off. And then we are off, with gypsum, we're putting calcium in as well. And so when what comes off, what the sulfate tends to break off, we're able to replace calcium back in there. And so you're breaking the peptizing elements off, the compaction elements off of magnesium and sodium, and you're replacing those with calcium, which gives you a longer term fix. Not only are you providing the calcium that the plant maybe needs that it's not getting in those soils, but you're also providing flocculation. And so you're using that sulfate to drive off some of those cations, replacing them back in with the calcium component, and so you're getting in the right ratio.
Okay. And by the way, for folks joining us today, this presentation will be made available again as an archive, and you'll be able to see the presentation and also hear what Cory has to say. So if you want to go back and review some parts of it, you can do that. Question here, what do you consider to be a long-term user of gypsum? How many years? It's probably good to talk about a little bit how gypsum is typically used as far as maybe from a corrective action and then to a maintenance type of program. That might help explain this a little bit too.
Yeah, that is good. The A lot of times, a first-time user of gypsum, maybe he's got the higher mag levels, or maybe he's got high sodium levels or low calcium type thing. Maybe the rate called for is a little higher. And I get growers all the time say, well, how much should I use? And well, there's a lot of factors into that. Is first of all, CEC I think is the first thing we want to look at. Second is maybe we want to look at base saturation numbers. Third, we want to look at the crop we're going to want to grow and yield goals that we're shooting for. But I also think fourth, and sometimes the one most looked at, is we've got to look at the economics. And corn at $3 is a little different economics than corn at $5, $6, or $7, and so we want to look at that. I've got growers that maybe their soils need a ton of gypsum to the acre, but economically we're applying half of that, or even sometimes a fourth of that, and we get results from that, but we don't maybe get as good a results as we could have gotten. I think that the goal is to always try to get everything into the right ratios and into the right balance. And so I think, I've got growers that use small rates that have been doing it for 10 years and doing well, and I've got growers that have used high rates and maybe only for a year or two and doing well. I think, long-term, short-term grower users of gypsum, I think a lot of that depends on our soil. I've got growers that, man, they do a gypsum application every 2 years or even 3 years, and they're able to supply the needed calcium and sulfur that their soils really need. Everything's in pretty good balance, doing a pretty good job. And I've got growers that, boy, we need to do something every year. And so I think the answer is very individualized. It's based upon the factors in your farm and your situation and your economics. But most generally, our growers, when we look at a long-term grower, it's somebody that's used gypsum in beyond 3 years, maybe 4 or 5. It'd be great. I looked at a soil test the other day of a grower that used a gypsum for more than 12 years, and well, you could tell it. I mean, boy, his nutrient levels were extremely high. Soil balance was really good, and you could tell it. I mean, and he was the question about the micronutrients before, he was looking at other things, and what can we do to get to the next level, and making that part of that.
Okay. These two questions are kind of related, so I'll read them both to you. One is, what can you kind of expect to see, after you've applied gypsum for the first time? And this one's a little bit more specific. This individual is asking, what is the availability of first-year sulfur and calcium if you're applying, say, 400 pounds of gypsum to either a light or a heavy soil? So it's kind of what can you expect? I know the other one's a little more specific.
Sure.
On how much sulfur and calcium can you find available after the first year of application?
Sure. Okay. Well, first time applications of gypsum, a lot of things that growers will tell me is take a penetrometer, and if you don't have a penetrometer, just take a round steel, a small fence post, and just go out there and push through the soil and find out how hard it takes you to push that to the soil. The penetrometer's got a nice little gauge on it. It tells you that. And one of the big things that we'll very frequently see is, boy, the number went down. And so instead of taking 300 or 400 psi to push through my soil, boy, it's only taken 200 or 300, or those kind of numbers. The other thing is, when we go out in the fields and we dig up plants, we'll see larger root systems, and that seems to really help. A lot of times, if I've got growers that got really wet fields, they're noticing that their fields dried out faster. If I've got a lot of times in the drought, if we're dry, because those soils are more flocculated, that water it was absorbed better, but it also comes back up better. It percolates back up to the soil better, and so those crops can hang on a little better in those stress environments. So that's a lot of the things that a first-time grower, as far as availability, it's very available products, because it's the sulfate form, that's the usable form of sulfur to a plant. And so those nutrients are very available right away, and the calcium as well. And so we're keeping those nutrients and getting those nutrients in the plant. And so I get a lot of growers that were buying 20, 30, 40 pounds of sulfur, putting it in, maybe with a nitrogen program. And what I'll do a lot of times is switch them to gypsum, and we'll use those dollars they were spending, and very easily we'll pay for gypsum, because gypsum's very economical from a calcium and sulfur perspective, and being able to supply nutrients to the plant. And so you're going to get those nutrients. The one question I will add to that just a little bit, Daryl, is I get a lot of times is, how long will this last? And if you're using a 400-pound rate, that's probably more of an annual application, for sure. If we're using higher rates of maybe 1,500, 2,000-pound rates, that may be a biannual, or if your soil warrants it, it may even be every third year. I mean, you have to look at your soil test and what you want, where you want to go and what you want to achieve.
Okay. Would low magnesium soils be an appropriate target for gypsum, or do you know whether something like dolomitic lime might be better?
Yeah, yeah. Low magnesium soils, and you do run into those every so often. We have those in the United States as well. And a lot of times what we'll do is we'll use maybe a combination of some gypsum and maybe dolomitic lime as well. Sulfur mag is another product that we might recommend in conjunction with the gypsum as well. With gypsum, you're not going to be supplying magnesium. You're going to be supplying calcium and sulfur. A lot of times, soils that are low mag, I've seen some soils sometimes were low mag but low calcium as well. And so sometimes in combination works better. But you just want to look at your soil test. You want to figure out what you have and what's the appropriate program, what's the appropriate product for you to be applying.
Okay. I don't know if you can answer this one, but one of the listeners is asking about what would be the yearly demand of calcium needed for soybeans. Have you run into that at all, or is that something you can answer?
Yeah, there is and I don't have that chart right in front of me, so I can't tell you right off just the top of my head what the demand is for calcium with soybeans. I know they're a strong user of the calcium. The calcium in a soybean plant is kind of a vital component of making that come together. I know that 1-to-10 ratio with the sulfur, if my memory serves me correct, it's somewhere in the same category when it comes to calcium that soybeans need. But the calcium really helps with the nodulation in the root zone, and really helps with nutrient absorption, because a soybean has a taproot type root system. You don't have very high soil to root contact, and the nutrients enter the plant over the back of a calcium ion. So if we have available calcium in that root zone, we can increase the nutrient absorption with like a taproot crop like that very effectively, and so you get a big response. But in the plant, calcium also is part of blossom formation, and so you have a plant that has multiple reproduction sites, like that. Calcium is a big component in that as well.
Okay. This is kind of an interesting question, and I'm going to read it back to you, but it gets a broader question. That it's, when amending my soil, should I apply, for example, maybe 2 tons to the acre, turn it under, plow it under, whatever you want to say, and maybe get it down to about 1 foot to 14 inches, and then maybe come back and add another 500 pounds to the top and not work that in? So it gets to the question, I guess, a little bit of, do you incorporate? Should you be incorporating gypsum? Does it matter? We have guys who no-till who don't want to touch the soil. So, is there
Sure.
is there a practice that's better, incorporating or not incorporating it?
That's a difficult question for a no-till guy, isn't it, Daryl?
Yeah, sure is.
The Gypsoil is, when they manufacture or we create gypsum this way with FGD gypsum, we're using a very high quality calcium ground to a very fine product, about 200 mesh. That's about the same mesh as face powder, and so it's a very solubilized product, very fine, and so it takes about 3.5 inches of rain to totally absorb 1,000 pounds of gypsum into the soil. So can you put it on top? Very easily, and it works very well. We have growers that put the 2-ton rates over the top, and we get absorption into that. I would maybe say, if you're putting those rates out, and you're looking at rainfall to put that in, wash that into the soil, maybe doing those applications in the fall might be, a better chance, so you have a longer period of time. But that would work fine. Can you till it into the soil? very easily. I mean, that's a good idea too. Obviously, anytime you incorporate something to soil, you've got better nutrient to soil contact. You might have a little quicker reaction, but both will work. Both would give you a good job. This has been a great thing with the no-till guys. A lot of guys really like that because of that solubility and getting those nutrients into that. Because it's so soluble, it can just go down in very quickly. But yet, if you've got a guy that's working his ground and he wants to till it in, that's an excellent option as well.
Does it really matter what crops you might be using gypsum with? Obviously we're dealing with a lot of corn, soybean growers, small grains, and wheat. Forages like alfalfa.
Yeah, I think it works with virtually. I find it works with all crops. Obviously a crop that had a higher calcium and sulfur need is maybe gonna give you the biggest yield results the quickest. But from a soil perspective and helping getting soils to where we want them to be, you're going to find, I think it's going to help all crops at any level. Maybe what I'll do, because if we can increase the rooting capacity, maybe a crop that has a very small root capacity, soybeans, I guess, is the one that pretty comes to mind. Is soybeans don't have a big root system underneath them a lot of times for the amount of foliage that they have. Corn we kind of have equal. We have about as much foliage usually below ground as we really do above ground. And so, but something like soybeans would maybe show a bigger response, I guess, would be the only thing I would say. But all would work. It would work really in almost any crop at any time.
How much have you degree have you worked with yield response to gypsum? And because one of the questions we have here is, obviously we see a lot about broadcast spreading in across the entire field, but have you worked in situations at all where maybe there's been some more prescriptive type of recommendation where you're whether you're variable rate applying it or you're applying it to certain parts of fields where you feel like it might have more benefit?
Yeah, a little bit of, I guess, along the lines of variable rate. We've got some growers that do some of that, where they'll run, in their areas where they need them, they'll run maybe a 1,200-pound rate in areas that need more, and maybe down to a 400 or 500-pound rate in areas where they need less. But I'm going to be honest with you, Daryl, we don't do that very often. Most of the time, a grower takes their average soil tests and they kind of look at it and say, okay, I'm going to do 1,000 pounds or a 2,000-pound rate is kind of our general rule of thumb. I had a grower ask me the other day, could he strip till this in? If he was strip tilling, could he strip till gypsum in? It would work if you could find a way to do it. It would be a lower rate, and obviously probably wouldn't have as big of a soil amendment type ability, but as far as supplying the sulfate and the calcium component, it would work. Could do that, but I would say 99% of the time it's just a broadcast program that a grower comes up with, looking at their soil test, and we come up with it, and they tend to treat, okay, the North Farm, we do a 1-ton rate, and the South Farm we're doing a 1,500-pound rate type of deal, is really what most of our growers do.
Okay. Almost out of time. A couple quick questions. One is availability. A couple people mentioned one is there availability of gypsum in Ontario. Another one asking about Southwest Idaho. So I don't know if it may not be
Well,
may not be your company, but maybe you've heard of places out there. So
Sure, exactly. And there's gypsum available in the country from various sources and mines and whatnot. Actually, Ontario is very good. We have actually we're working on a barge coming out of Michigan, DTE, one of our big power plant suppliers there that we get material from, and loading barges and taking it over to Ontario. And we have good availability in Ontario. Pretty much anywhere you would need a material. Idaho, we don't have any sources that we work with currently. I do know I've done meetings in Idaho in the past, and there are gypsum mines out there that you can look up that you could possibly purchase gypsum from out there. But we don't at this time. Not that we may in the future, I guess is the best way to say that.
okay. What I guess last question. What can you tell me about that Midwest Soil Improvement Symposium that you're putting on, and what folks might learn at that?
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, we're doing, and we do this. It's an annual event. This is our fourth event. It'll be the first for me because I'm kind of new to Gypsoil, but we're going to have speakers from Kansas State University, Ohio State University. We're going to have folks from Arkansas State University are going to come in and talk about, you know, their research and what they've done with gypsum, from water quality and soil erosion aspects to nutrient efficiency to yields to soil properties, all the different aspects of that. And we're going to have a spreading presentation and talking about how to spread it. And then the part that I actually like the best is at the end, they actually have a grower panel and growers that have used gypsum for a while, and they're going to answer the questions that people have about using gypsum and doing it. So it's in Manhattan, Kansas. It's coming up here next week, and but no, go to our website. You can find a link to that. It would be great to have that. We call it the Midwest Soil Improvement Symposium, and you can. We'd be glad to have you come down.
Very good. Well, I appreciate sharing information with us today, Cory. And before we conclude, I just want to give a heads up to everyone that when you log off today, I believe we're going to have a short questionnaire for you to complete, a very simple one. And it helps us determine the value of today's webinar and also plan for future webinars. And secondly, we're going to be making available via email to you a replay of today's webinar in the event you'd like to go back and review the entire presentation or parts of the presentation. You'll also find that replay is going to be up on our No-Till Farmer website shortly. And on that website, there is a webinar archives section where you can listen to other recently completed webinars as well. And we got through all the questions. Sure, thank you for submitting all those, folks. I do want to thank Cory again for leading today's presentation. And I want to thank the folks at Gypsoil brand Gypsum for sponsoring today's webinar. And also thanks to producer Cole Vandermouse for helping us through all the technology and getting us rolling and set up. We hope that you're having some good progress with your crops, and we look forward to having you join us for our next No-Till Farmer webinar. However, goodbye for now, and have a good rest of the week.